thank you all for attending this first event of the lecture series of Tulane School of Architecture. We are starting after we have gone through the peak of the semester and things are rolling, and we feel like we have more room to breathe and to get nurtured with events like this. This is the first one, as I was saying, of a lecture series that is based about human inhabitation and the big topics that we have in our human inhabitations. Human inhabitation and equity, human inhabitation and climate change, human inhabitation and politics, human inhabitation and aging, and human inhabitation and health, or human inhabitation and development, or the natural environment. So this is our first of this series, and we are bringing in this series, in this lecture series, our new stars among other external guests. And our first one is Edson Cabalfin. Edson Cabalfin will be introduced by Ken, but I just want to emphasize how lucky we are of these new faculty colleagues that we want to be part of this lecture series of this year, the full year, fall and spring. And this lecture series in this Zoom format want to be a little bit a little bit faster and with more movement that a regular lecture. So in this hour format, we want to have a presentation, but by our first guest, let's say, in this case, Edson, but an important role of our respondents, experts in the field that are from the school or from Tulane, from other departments, because all these topics are crossing fields of knowledge. So in all cases, we will be discussing among people who are coming with different perspectives and backgrounds and meeting in this intersection of how we inhabit in this planet through the lenses of, in this case, equity. That is what what is going to be this session. Among the two respondents, Christopher Oliver. Christopher Oliver is a PhD professor of practice in sociology and environmental studies program, and is the Abram Glaser professor of social entrepreneurship at the Taylor Center at Tulane University. So very well occupied to discuss with Edson from a parallel perspective. And of course, Carol Rees, our professor. He's a historian, a PhD, as well as a very important a Favre professor and a very important constituent of our faculty that brings a very diverse background and series of knowledge to our programs, to our 3 programs, 4 programs, 5 programs that we have at the School of Architecture right now. So thank you very much all for being here. This is very exciting, and please, Ken, I leave you to introduce the specifics of the session today.
Great. Thank you, Iñaki. I'm very pleased to offer this introduction for Dr. Edson Cabalfin, Professor of Practice in Design Thinking and Director of the school's Social Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship program. My own dual role as a Professor of Architecture and the Taylor Center Executive Director puts me in a good position given the way that the SICE program connects the School of Architecture, Edson's academic home, with the Phyllis Taylor Center for Social Innovation and Design Thinking. While the SICE minor started in the School of Architecture 2 years before the university launched the Taylor Center in 2014, the 2 academic units have been connected ever since in highly productive ways. At this point, Edson joins others whose expertise in teaching, research, and engagement spans between the 2, including Dr. Leslie Ann Noel, who is also a professor of practice with her home at the Taylor Center and in her role as the director of Taylor's Design Thinking program. She also teaches in the Design Thinking courses within SICE as well. And as I get to the introduction of Edson, I want to also acknowledge Rebecca Otten, who has led the SICE minor over the last several years and who has handed off those responsibilities to Edson. As a professor of practice in the Taylor Center, she has been very effective in providing the collaborative bridge that has benefited students, faculty, and staff across TSA, Taylor, and throughout the entire university. So on behalf of Dean Alday, I want to thank her for her great work in the directorship role, and she will be continuing her work as Director of Strategy and Engagement for the Taylor Center and will continue to teach in SICE as well. Edson comes to us from the University of Cincinnati, his latest stop on an impressive journey that includes several universities in the United States and internationally as well. I won't go through his entire CV, but I will note that he is uniquely qualified through education and experience to operate in a fundamentally cross-disciplinary way. This will certainly redound to the benefit of the SICE program, to be sure, and it will also help the School of Architecture in evolving the program over the next several years. His Doctor of Philosophy degree in the History of Architecture is from Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, along with a Master of Architecture degree from Cincinnati before that. His first degrees in architecture are from the University of the Philippines, as is his professional license as an architect. His teaching and professional work have been far-reaching, both in terms of geography as well as cross-disciplinary emphasis. In addition to his numerous projects and notable exhibitions, such as the Venice Biennale, he has published 2 books and one that is currently under review for publication soon, as well as numerous peer-reviewed articles and chapters. On behalf of Dean Alday and the faculty of the School of Architecture, I want to extend our warm welcome to Edson and to let him know how excited we are to have him joining us on the faculty. The title of his lecture is Human Inhabitation and Equity, Right to the City and Neoliberal Urbanism in the Philippines. Welcome, Edson.
Thank you so much, Ken. And also thank you so much, Dean Alday, for the warm welcome. And also in advance, I want to thank Carol and Chris with their response later on, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. So let me just share my screen to start off. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And as had been mentioned, this is part of the lecture series of the Tulane School of Architecture. And for this afternoon, I will be talking about neoliberal urbanism in the Philippines as a sort of like a lens into looking at human inhabitation and equity. So as Ken had mentioned earlier, one of the recent roles that I performed was as curator of the Philippine Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018. And in this exhibition, which I titled The City Who Had Two Navels, I specifically looked at 2 forces of colonialism and neoliberalism and how it shapes Philippine cities. And so for this afternoon, I'll be specifically focusing on this aspect of neoliberalism. And here's just an image of that exhibition back in 2018. And I began to look at these forces of neoliberalism and colonialism and how it then shapes and how it informs the kind of lifestyle and production and experience of cities in the Philippines. And one of the things that I wanted to emphasize in this exhibition that the process of neoliberalism and neoliberalization is not only limited to the Philippines, but is in fact something that is happening globally. So this exhibition was also based on an idea, the idea of right to the city that was first presented and proposed by Henry Lefebvre in 1968 and later on also discussed by David Harvey, and which is premised on the idea of how cities is sort of, there's a call to action to reclaim the city as co-created space. And David Harvey, for example, talks about this as the collective power to reshape the process of urbanization. And so this idea of right to the city, I am then tying, as David Harvey, for example, discusses before, to this idea of how it shapes then and informs the formation and production of our city. So for this afternoon, I'll focus specifically on the question of how does neoliberalism shape Philippine cities? And by doing that, I will also then first talk about and define what I mean by neoliberalism and also what I mean by neoliberal urbanism, that will then go into a discussion of then how these processes would shape and inform the production of Philippine cities and subsequently other cities around the world. So let me just first start off by defining what I mean by neoliberalism. And by neoliberalism, which is a mouthful, I start off with this definition, and by this I mean as these are economic and political policies that emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And specifically, these are economic and political policies that were then put forward and, in fact, pushed also by then the Prime Minister of the UK, Margaret Thatcher, and then Ronald Reagan, then the President of the United States. So these were economic political policies that were then enacted from that time that since would have a repercussion, of course, across the globe. And neoliberalism as a philosophy and also as an ideology is really rooted on key principles. These are economic and political policies that focused on the free trade, free market, privatization, deregulation, and minimal state intervention. And allow me to also just briefly define some of these principles to set the ground for then our understanding of neoliberal urbanism later on. So one of the first key principle of neoliberalism is the idea of free trade, which refers to the unrestricted movement of goods, services, and people across national borders. So through agreements, countries have allowed the transportation and then the crossing of goods, people, and services through controlling and also actually allowing tariff and having this free movement. The second principle of neoliberalism is that of the free market, which is sort of defined as how prices of services and goods are determined by the open market and consumers. And that there should be these sort of open market should be free from governmental intervention. The third principle of neoliberalism, the second still part of the idea of free market is that the prices of services and goods usually follow the forces of supply and demand. The third principle of neoliberalism refers to the idea of competition, that it's rooted in a competitive sort of environment where prices and services are driven by competition in the free market. And then the fourth idea or principle of neoliberalism is that of privatization, which refers to how public services, for example, transportation, telecommunications, water, energy, are then privatized or placed under private control and private companies. And then the fifth principle of neoliberalism refers to deregulation, which then refers to how there should be minimal regulation and intervention by the government. That somehow the government is expected to provide a structure for then the private sector, for the businesses to flourish and allow to grow within this free market. So these five principles of neoliberalism, which I know sometimes can be very vague, or sometimes it's hard to connect to that of architecture or to cities. And so we can think about then how these forces also are something that's also dominating now, that it's the dominant economic political condition in many parts of the world, which also would have then social cultural implications. And so when we begin to think about this as a sort of a global force, then we can then also begin to think about like how this would affect subsequently that of cities and human habitation. And so the next concept that I would like to also then sort of define, which leads to sort of my discussion about how neoliberalism operates in the Philippines, is the idea of neoliberal urbanism. And neoliberal urbanism, by this I mean as the production and experience of cities as shaped by the neoliberal ideology, which means that there is usually an aim or a goal of trying to constantly make cities competitive to be able to attract investment and the flow of capital into these cities. And so cities are being reshaped, they're being developed, all in the goal of trying to attract more capital and surplus. And so that's a key concept then in how neoliberalism as economic and political policies then would then have a direct sort of implication to that of urbanism and urbanization. And again, this can be very abstract sometimes, and this can be very confusing or very complex. So I will try to show then how specifically this is manifested in the Philippines. So I'll be using the Philippines as sort of like a lens to be able to show how this works, knowing also and understanding that there are also variations in terms of how neoliberal urbanism happens or occurs across the world. So let me start then by talking about some different sort of activities, phenomena that is happening in the Philippines specifically as manifestation of this neoliberal urbanism. So the first one that we are seeing right now, and especially in the last couple of decades, is that of the rise of enclave mixed-use business districts. Now, mixed-use business districts or central business districts are not new. It has been going on for for many decades. But what's specifically happening in the Philippines is that of these enclave business districts that are sprouting within the larger metropolitan city. So meaning that there are these sort of like smaller pockets of business districts that are emerging within the larger structure of the metropolitan city. And usually this self-sustained or these enclave business districts are also purporting to be self-sustaining or self-sustained, that then all of the activities, various multi-use functions are happening within these enclave cities. So I'm just showing you an aerial view of a part of metropolitan Manila where you have on the sort of like the upper left Ayala Triangle, which is the Makati Central Business Districts. But you're also seeing other sort of business districts like Rockwell, which is on the lower part. And then there's an emerging new district called the Circuit, and sort of like in the middle part of the image, which is growing and developing within the larger urban structure and urban fabric. And these central business districts are in a way decentralized. There are multiple nodes within the city, but they're also becoming, of course, like focus. There's like a lot of focus in terms of the investment that's pouring into a lot of the central business districts. And here's just a map to show you how in Metro Manila, which is the part of the national capital region of the Philippines, these circles indicate some of the locations of existing business districts, and then which are in gray, and then the red ones are showing you some of the future business districts that are happening and that are being built currently. And this is just to show you in Metro Manila, because this event and this phenomena is actually happening in many other cities across the Philippines. And this is Rockwell City, one of the cities that I was mentioning to you. And you can see how it's within private property, and then surrounding it are usually low-level type of development. And then you have to get into these sort of developments and enclave districts through secure points of entry. And you can see like how it's really sort of sprouting within kind of like the landscape within the city. Here's another example of this enclave business district. This is the Bonifacio Global City, which is very close by to the Makati Central Business District. And this was part of a former military base that was later on converted into a new global city. And you can see the skyscrapers and the high-rise building that are then emerging and being built in this area, which includes residential, offices, commercial, very typical of cities, with all of these multifunctional, multifunction happening within this enclave districts. But so what's very specific though with this rise of enclave business districts is that these are in fact being driven by a very specific type of business, which is that of the IT BPOs, and this refers to that of information technology business process outsourcing. In sort of simple terms, these are companies that offer back of house services for a lot of companies, most of them in the US, especially the ones that are in the Philippines. And they do, let's say, legal and medical transcription. A lot of customer service calls are directed here. So, for example, if you're calling Travelocity, Convergys, or anything, it's probably most probably going to be diverted to the Philippines. And the reason why this is now a very important industry is because the IT BPO industry contributes to about 10% of the country's GDP. And these are mostly owned by American, European, or Australian companies that are then being built in the Philippines. What's also very interesting to point out here is that IT BPOs as an industry in the Philippines the Philippines is now one of the most, the biggest, the largest service industry providing business process outsourcing. It employs about 1 million people, even surpassing that of India back in 2015 as the largest employer of IT BPOs. And so this is a phenomenon that we see then in cities across the Philippines. This one, for example, the Cebu Business Park. This is in Cebu City in the middle part of the country, where the offices are being built specifically to attract these BPO industries, these contact and call centers. And I'll show you and I'll explain more of that later on. But the development is really driving then the creation of these new mixed-use development. This is another one. This is in Iloilo, also in the middle part of the country, where the former airport, for example, is converted into this new business park, where the offices, again, are mostly for these call centers or contact centers. Another one, this is Eastwood City, part of this enclave development, where then you see the inclusion and the combination of residential condominiums, shopping malls, offices, and entertainment within this very small plot within kind of like this larger urban fabric. A second phenomenon that we see with neoliberal urbanism is that of the privatization of public spaces. And by this, we mean how common spaces are now controlled by that of the private sector. And we see this specifically as in conjunction with the rise of shopping centers and mixed-use development as that of like the primary public space now for a lot of Filipinos. And this is just one example of them, SM Mega Mall, which is the third largest mall in the world with about 500,000 square meters of leasable area. What's interesting about this phenomenon is that then a lot of Filipinos now prefer to use shopping malls as a place of entertainment. They would go there during Sundays. And so it has, in fact, supplanted that of public spaces outside, and you can imagine in a tropical country like the Philippines, it's fully air conditioned. It's a very popular place. In fact, there are also chapels or churches built within the malls to basically attract then Filipinos into the fold. And these public spaces that are found in shopping malls have now replaced that of those public plazas or open spaces that used to be the dominant type of spaces during the late 18th or 19th century and even the early 20th century, when during the Spanish colonial period and American colonial period, they had built all of these public plazas, including like this, the Mall of Church Plaza in Iloilo City, where you do have an open space that then allows anybody to use them for whatever purpose. There's sort of no control necessarily because it's really open to the public. But with privatization, though, of public spaces, as there is a shift of these public spaces from public land to that of private property, as Filipinos use now most of these malls, a lot of these public spaces now are being either created and or in fact controlled by these private companies like this one. This is Ayala Center in Cebu City. They have a public park in the middle. But for you to be able to access these parks is that you have to be able to then enter the mall first, because it is within private property and within the development of the shopping mall. And so we also see, as part of this privatization, is that of the conversion of some of the last remaining open spaces and public spaces in the metro city area that are then they're being converted into commercial space. This is an example of one of the last remaining forests in Manila, which is the Roceros Forest Park. And just a couple of months ago, it was already scheduled to be demolished or to be turned into a new shopping center complex. Good thing, though, that the new mayor of Manila overturned the decision that was done by the previous mayor and then declared this forest park as a protected green space within the city. But a lot of these green spaces are then under threat from commercial development. And so this idea of these public spaces being in private control, there's also the idea of how the public spaces are now being militarized, which means that, let's say, from a public space like this, and then converting it then to that of the private space of the malls, you will see that then for you to be able to enter, as I said, you usually need to go through these security points. These are just some images of how you need to go through these phalanx of security guards, and that they screen then who are able to enter and not enter the malls. So this sort of militarization of these public spaces then would show you how some of these public spaces are then only serving that of, let's say, the upper income or the upper status of the society. For example, this is Bonifacio High Street in the Bonifacio Global City, and there's a certain there are security points, and so they have policies, for example, that if you are wearing particular clothes, that they will not even allow you. So, for example, you cannot enter these malls with wearing flip-flops, sleeveless shirts, and so they have a very particular decorum that they control and also implement within these spaces. So they are not necessarily truly open to the public, because there's only a very particular segment of the population that are actually able to enter the city. So it's a completely sort of shift from public now to private control. A third phenomenon that we see is the idea of how the city is expanding through neoliberalism. Again, cities have expanded all the time over centuries. That's nothing new. But what's happening now, for example, in different cities in the Philippines, is that the cities are aggressively and exponentially expanding over the decades, and how there's now a blurring of urban and rural zones. So you can't really sometimes tell now what is where the urban area ends and where the rural area begins. And so the city now expands through the periphery. And this is a good sort of image to show you of how this phenomenon of the city expanding really is quite palpable. These are land satellite images by NASA of Metro Manila The one on the left is from 1989, and then the one on the right is from 2012. And you can see the pink areas as the built areas and how it has exponentially grown over decades. And here I'll just zoom in again to show you. Here's more of a brown. The brown color refers to the built-up areas. This is from 1988, and this is from 2014. So let me go back to just show you again how it has expanded exponentially, creeping the sort of the green areas or the green agricultural areas on the periphery over the last 25 years or so. And so what's happening then is that when the city expands, of course, they need land to be able to expand to. And guess where they're getting the land to expand these commercial and residential subdivisions? They're converting a lot of the agricultural land at the periphery of the cities, and that they are now converting them to these commercial and residential use. But then what's also happening concurrently is that the farmers and who are tending and who own some of these land are then either being displaced or being bought out by a lot of these developers. And this is just a stark image to show you that the subdivision, this residential subdivision in Cavite, here on the right, and you see the wall that divides it, because this used to be agricultural land, which, as you see here on the left part of the image. And so the agricultural land are slowly being eaten out and being converted to some of these cities. Now, what makes this also quite particularly specific to the Philippines is that, again, residential subdivisions and the growth of the city is nothing new as a phenomenon. However, what's driving this expansion of the city and the demand for residential subdivisions are this group of Filipinos that we call overseas Filipino workers, or OFW. So these are Filipinos that are out in the world. They're working outside the Philippines, and then they send remittances and monies to their families in the Philippines. I think right now there's about 10 million Filipinos outside the Philippines. And what's also then crucial about this is that then the OFWs, their remittances are contributing to another 10% of the country's GDP. So the business process outsourcing are contributing 10%. The OFW remittances are contributing another 10% to the country's GDP. So you can imagine the growth that the money that's coming in from the remittances are making a substantial impact on the growth of the city, particularly as residential subdivisions like this in Imo City, Cavite, which used to be agricultural land, are now expanding aggressively. Again, not just in Metro Manila, even in the southern part of the Philippines. This is Davao City. It's also expanding. And so you see that phenomenon as not only limited and usually also in concurrent with some of the central business districts that are also happening across the Philippines. A fourth phenomenon that then we're also seeing is that there is also now a homogenization of these cities, which means that almost all of these cities looks and feels the same. Mark Auger, for example, calls this a non-place where it is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And you can see how there's all of these cities are pretty much looking like the same, any kind of other new city across the world. So you can't even tell whether this is where you're in the Philippines, whether you're in parts of Tokyo, are you in parts of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and so on, because of the kind of similarities in the look, the aesthetics, and also kind of the production and the operation of these cities. Here's another one in Cebu City in the middle part of the country. And then this is also Bonifacio Global City, where a lot of these buildings, again, look much like each other. Another sort of connected idea to this is how these cities are also then now being converted into a truly 24/7 city. Now, New York might claim that it's the city that never sleeps, but what's happening now is that a lot of these cities are truly becoming city that never sleeps. I don't think New York can even compare to that, because in New York, people would party all night, and they would work all day. But this is different from here, because as the cities are now also servicing that of night workers, aside from the day workers, the cities have now become a 24-hour operation where transportation, restaurants, commercial, and others are open 24 hours. And this is really driven by those IT BPO services and companies, because then they need to operate at night. And the reason they operate at night is because, as I mentioned earlier, these companies are servicing mostly American companies. And Manila is 12 hours ahead of New York, for example. And so a lot of these employees of these contact centers would come in sometimes, at 7 o'clock at night, have breakfast at the time, start work at around 9 o'clock in the evening, have lunch at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then leave work at sometime like 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning, and then have happy hour at 10 o'clock in the morning. And then the day workers would come in into the cities, and then they would have another sort of life. But you do have these night shifts and day shift workers who are then dominating then these cities, and that the cities need to operate 24 hours. And so the night workers in these IT BPOs live, work, and play differently because of the different lifestyle that is demanded, and or by which then their work then creates for them. However, there have already been studies that show that these kinds of night shifts that's been going on for years really have taken a toll on the health of these workers. So they are finding now that there's a lot of stress-related health issues with these night shift workers, because of how their time, their body clock is completely sort of reversed. Their circadian rhythm is sort of like messed up, and how it's then also creating more stress for them. And so we can think about like how the quality, what kind of quality of life is then being created with these workers within the city. And this is just one of the call contact centers, and how a lot of these contact centers, for example, as you can see here, the workers are in small cubicles, usually tied to their tables, and that they are then talking to or using computers most of the time, with no windows in a lot of these places, because then they want to make sure that this is pretty bright and also very much operational, even 24, kind of like in the evening shift. And then the sixth sort of phenomenon related to neoliberal urbanism is how there are a lot of, aside from the enclave business developments, there are also a rise in terms of how informal settlements also then expands within the city. A lot of slums and squatter communities are expanding, and that they are also continually being marginalized. The government doesn't provide them necessarily with services. Sometimes they don't have water, access to drinking water. Sometimes they don't even have electricity, and that they usually live and or build a lot of these sort of temporary structures over sort of like areas that are not normally either paid attention to by the government. And here's just like a map of Metro Manila again, showing you some of the areas where there are a concentration of these informal settlements. So the yellow areas in the map indicates then the areas of informal settlements. And these are just some numbers on the left here, just to give you an indication that, for example, back in 2003, and this number is already, of course, out of date, but about 33% of the population of informal settlements are living in Metro Manila. And there's, at that time in 2002, there's about 2.54 million. And again, this is almost 20 years ago, and this has exploded exponentially over the last 2 decades. But you can see like how these informal settlements are also scattered and also within the city of Manila. And here are just some images of these informal settlements. This is Baseco in Manila, close to the port area. And they are living close to the mouth of the Pasig River, the main estuary that runs through the Metro Manila. So you can imagine also the kind of like pollution, the kind of damage that's also being done in terms of the urban areas, but also like the social inequity that's also happening and how they're not receiving services. Here's another a part of Manila where the informal settlements have built beside the railway station, which is again not only it's a phenomenon that's not only limited to the Philippines. You see this, of course, all over the world. But what's also interesting about the rise of these informal settlements is that these informal settlements normally and usually house also the low-wage workers that are being required to staff and operate some of these enclave business developments. So the purportedly self-contained enclave business districts, well, you still need people to clean janitorial services. You need somebody to garden and maintain the grounds. You also need people to also then staff the malls, for example, manning the kiosk and others. So you need laborers to be able to make sure that these enclave business districts survive and also operate. But these low-wage income earners are not living in these enclave business districts because they could not afford to live in those very expensive condos. And so these low-wage income workers would find accommodations, and guess where they find them? In informal settlements. And so these are the growth of these informal settlements collide and also in parallel with that of the growth of the city. So I go back to this image of Bonifacio Global City, which is this emerging city here on kind of like the middle part of the picture. But look at the image on the village just right across the freeway on the right, which is part of Taguig City. And that's where a lot of some of the workers actually find some of these accommodations. I'll show you just a little bit more sort of like stark images, Google Earth images of, again, this is also Bonifacio Global City again, and you have Pembo, East Pembo here on the right, showing you kind of like this stark difference of these informal settlements and residential subdivisions. Another part, Makati City and Pasay City here. Makati is the central business district that I was mentioning earlier. This is Eastwood City here on the left, and then just over the river, you have Santolan area where you have a lot of these informal settlements as well. Here's another stark image. This is an area in Quezon City, which is in the northern part of Metro Manila. The hexagonal plot here on the right is the National Legislative Center. So this is where congressmen and Congress actually meets. And the ironic part is that then just beyond their property are these informal settlements that have grown since the 1960s and 1970s, when these were places where the laborers and the construction workers who built the legislative complex here on the right lived, and that eventually over the decades it grew and expanded. And here's just another image, an aerial view of that legislative center, House of Congress here on the upper left, and how just outside its property line, you will see all of these informal settlements that have grown over the years. And then kind of like the last phenomena that I'd like to highlight with neoliberal urbanism is this idea of accumulation by dispossession, an idea that David Harvey had also talked about and had proposed before. And what he talks about accumulation by dispossession is that the accumulation of wealth, especially in these cities, are in sort of, to do this is that then it needs to dispossess, or that its effect is that it dispossesses and disenfranchises a certain population. So there are certain segments of the population that are marginalized and oppressed, as another, the much more wealthier and more powerful segment of the population continues to develop income and profit through a lot of these developments that they are also pushing, and also what neoliberalism is also then pushing. And so the rise of informal settlements, as I've said before, as these cities grow, more and more people are also then living in informal settlements where they do not have services, basic services such as water and electricity, and it continues to expand as these business districts also expand. Farmers, as I've said, are also being dispossessed and disenfranchised because they're also being kicked out from the land that they are tilling, as these agricultural land is also being converted to commercial work. Or the low-income office workers, for example, these are workers in Makati City, the central business district, where they could not even find affordable food sources or places for lunch or for dinner, because even though there's a lot of restaurants around the central business district, not everybody could afford it. So these are these kiosks that were built over time that later on the city had actually then sort of appropriated and made it more formalized, became these alternative sources of lunches and food for these office workers. Or you also see, for example, these are entrepreneurial Filipinos also who create these sort of temporary and informal stores under these elevated skyways to provide, let's say, food for taxi drivers and motorcycle drivers and commuters who might not have an access to food as they are plying some of these expressways. But these are not regulated. You know, the government does not. These are illegal, and yet these are also happening because of sort of like the lack of providing accommodations and or services for these types of entrepreneurial segments. So to kind of just summarize and to sort of end my talk, neoliberal urbanism occurs and is manifested in the Philippines through the cities, through these different phenomena. But again, I would like to emphasize that these are not necessarily, not all of them are necessarily unique to the Philippines. We'll see some of them in other parts of the world. But we need to understand also that there are also very specific realities that are happening in the Philippines because of neoliberalization and in the formation of these cities. So to end, I will just like to pose questions, you know, and sort of ideas to think about and questions to mull and see in terms of like, how do we move from here? I want to also just emphasize also that in neoliberalism, because of competition, we have to remember that there will always be winners and losers. Not everybody will win in neoliberalism. And so we have to think who gets to win and who gets to lose within this process. So some of the questions I would like you to think about, for example, is like, what will happen to the future of cities if it continues under neoliberalization? Another question could be, what will happen to our public spaces and civic commons in the future? We also need to think about what will happen to the future generations of Filipinos who work at night. And I also would like for us to think about what will happen to our farmlands and food production in the future as cities continue to expand. And then we also need to think about how can we design our cities that are ennobling to all and not just to a select few. And therefore, these are also broader questions about how can architecture and cities empower and ennoble people? And then how can cities become more inclusive, equitable, humane, and sustainable? And then how can architecture and cities be an instrument of positive change? So my challenge to all of you is to think about, what is your position? You know, what do you think about neoliberalism? What do you think about neoliberal urbanization? And then think about, what are we supposed to do now? What will you or what will we do now? So I would like to end my lecture with those questions. And thank you so much.
Fabulous. So we'll now move to the respondent portion of our event. Carol, Christopher, do you have any responses from Edson's lecture or some of those great questions he posed?
Well, I have lots of questions, lots of more questions, many more questions than answers. I'm really, I'm trying to think of where I would like to start, but I'm actually thank you for that, Edson. I really, I think I've landed once in Manila.
Oh,
That's
really?
it. Here's one thing that occurs to me. I mean, I'm very interested in whether you think it's important to tease out more of the ideas about what is specific to the Philippines. And so when I see you, I was struck actually by the remark about remittances and the flow of those remittances into the Philippines and the effect that they're having on urbanization. For me though, and I hope you'll enlighten me, when you showed the pictures of residential developments and put them next to this idea of the importance of remittances, I was thinking, well, these are upper middle class, upper middle class neighborhoods. And when I think of remittances being sent home, for example, to Central America, those remittances are not really going to what we would consider, I think, middle class residential districts. So that was one question that I had. And then if I might, they're in totally opposite directions. But as a historian, I'm also wondering, you know, if you might speak about, or maybe it seems, you know, too far removed, whether or not the colonial history of the Philippines has anything to do with what you see happening here. So just, you could take those questions in either take them, leave them, or go in any direction.
Thank you, Carol, for those questions. Let me answer a little bit the second one, your second question about colonialism. And you're right. There is a huge impact in terms of the colonial experience of the Philippines. And for those of you who might not be familiar, just briefly, the Philippines was a Spanish colony from the 16th century until 1898. And after the Spanish-American War of 1898, the Philippines, together with Puerto Rico and Cuba, were ceded to the United States. And so from 1898 to 1946, at the end of the World War II, the Philippines then became or was an American colony. And the reason why I say that is because I don't think, in fact, a lot of Americans are aware that that the US was in fact a colonizer, right? And again, that there's a lot of debate surrounding that. But I appreciate that you raised that question, Carol, because even in the exhibition at the Venice Architecture Biennale, that was in fact the other navel that I was talking about in the city who had two navels, because that was also part of the argument is that, and what I was also trying to propose is that, in fact, colonialism and neoliberalism are intertwined. That then, that I'm arguing that they couldn't be seen as sort of separate forces even in the history, not just in the history of the Philippines, but also in the history in other cities across the world. And so there is very much an impact of colonialism, and I can't really explain fully what they are, but just to say sort of like in simple terms, the sort of political structure was sort of like a result of American colonization. Another example would be the reason why there's also a lot of BPOs in the Philippines and call centers is because a lot of American companies then comes to the Philippines specifically because Filipinos relatively don't have an accent. And with all of these customer service calls, that was the reason why the Philippines also surpassed India because a lot of the American companies then shifted their services to the Philippines, as they found that Filipinos, because of the colonial history, understood American pop culture, they understood references, and therefore they were sort of, at least the American companies thought that they were better equipped in answering and responding to American customers. So that's sort of like just a simple sort of example to show you how, you know, English, which was then pushed and required by the American colonial government, you know, in the early 20th century, it then sort of became embedded, obviously, in the educational system, and that eventually in the kind of the creation of professionals in the future. So that's sort of like just one brief example of that. So you're right, there's definitely a very intertwined relationship. The earlier question, you were asking about the subdivisions, right?
The remittances, right?
The remittances.
And they're right.
And the images that I was showing you, the residential subdivisions, you're right that there are mostly upper middle class type of development. And I think one of the effect of these remittances over the last 50, 60 years is that then it had produced, it created more middle class in the Philippines. And so it aside from remittances that were coming from, that were then being directed to maybe the lower income families or lower income population, there was still a huge part of these remittances that were actually going to sort of like middle class. So that's why you find, because you find, for example, teachers in the Philippines who then move to Hong Kong, for example, to work as domestic helpers or as nannies. And so, or nurses who also then move to, let's say, the US to become caregivers, you know, in retirement homes, and so on. So, so the people who are actually moving also abroad, also a lot of them come from the middle class. So that's why there's also a lot of demand for some of these subdivisions also. But you're right, it's not all middle class. And these are just some examples of kind of these very, very clear sort of connection, you know, with the remittances.
I have a question. You framed this in the context of the right to the city. And then I think that in terms of the presentation, I was trying to think of it, was that conceptualization such to try to understand how what's happening is kind of subverting some of the important aspects of what the right to the city is, or is the right to the city something that can be a resistance or reaction to those kind of processes? I guess I'm just in a broader sense of like, how would you frame that within these larger processes, and how does that get, especially when we think about kind of global processes, moving to local processes, because you've identified a lot of those linkages in a way that's really, really important.
Right. Maybe I think my failure is to, in fact, bring that back, you know, to talk about right to the city. And the reason why I use it also as a frame is that I use it as a frame to think about like how maybe we can subvert, you know, we can subvert some of these processes and the resistances. And maybe there will be another portion that I could actually talk about what are some of these resistances and subversion to be able to maybe reach that point of this collective action that David Harvey was talking about, and thinking about how some of these forces might actually be challenged, right? And you're right, like I wasn't able to really show you some examples, but in the exhibition in the Venice Architecture Biennale in the Philippine Pavilion, I did actually show some of these examples of how there were, for example, alternative practices of architecture where they were trying to subvert this kind of neoliberal driven development in architecture, and how they're trying to not actually do that, you know. And so they're servicing, for example, or they're catering specifically to these informal settlements. These were architects and planners who had purposely also then they're helping them design their own communities for them. And maybe I should have maybe talked about it more, but I think that was a beginning point that I think it could be connected back again and to show some of those resistances. That's a very good point.
Absolutely. No, I think, and that's a lot. That's a huge ask, right? There's a
It
lot.
is.
You're working with a lot. I mean, you're working with so many different scales, and like so much is going on. And you do such a great job of identifying specifically about urban development and design and how these things play out, especially within neoliberalism, and then in the context of globalization, which is important. And I was thinking when you were identifying like the militarization and securitization of like the mall and those kinds of things, of the ways in which Lefebvre talks about, concretely creating abstract space as a way to get around and commodify to a certain extent space in a way that kind of then subverts these issues that he talks about with the right to the city. So exactly. I think you're definitely there. It was all there, but I was just curious, about how you bring those things back around.
And I think, Chris, like you make a good point, because I think that's the challenge with looking at neoliberalization and also neoliberal urbanism. It's a very complex phenomenon, right? And I think what I was also wanting to be able to show is that, because I think some people like think of, and I had this discussion also when I was in the Philippines, is that when I posed the question of neoliberalism and neoliberal urbanism, to architects, I gave this lecture at the equivalent of the American Institute of Architects in the Philippines. And so I had an audience of 4,000 architects. And what was interesting is that, when I presented that, some of them were saying that, they've even never heard of that term, which is ironic, because then what they don't realize is that they're actually complicit to it, because they're the ones designing the malls. They're the ones who are designing the residential subdivisions. And yet they don't even realize that they are participating in that process, because for some people, it's such a complex and maybe abstract idea, but there are palpable and kind of very concrete ways by which then this sort of operates.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Oh, Carol, you're on mute. Sorry.
You referred to the issue of public space. And so I'm just wondering whether in this neoliberal climate, whether the government has completely abrogated its responsibility to providing, some sense of leadership in terms of the provision of civic amenities. Mm-hmm. So what do you see happening there in that case?
That is exactly the kind of challenge, right? That because of the process of neoliberalism, that then the private sector expects that then government sort of abdicates, like that there should be minimal state intervention. But then kind of like the sort of the downside of that is that then some of these public amenities, for example, are then also then forgotten, or they're also ignored, like public spaces. So you're right to say that the government's role in providing some of these public amenities, they really step back. And that example that I show of that forest park, the sort of like the last remaining park forest in Manila, that's why it's interesting to see how the former mayor of Manila, in fact, approved that forest to be commercialized. So the government is also sort of, they're the ones also facilitating the kind of eradication of all of these public spaces. And then at the same time, but then kind of what happened then afterwards when the new mayor of Manila stepped in, he reversed it, and he declared it as a protected forest area. So it kind of like shows you you're right, like about the political will and the kind of the leadership of who then is responsible for leadership. Now, on kind of also on the flip side, that example that I showed of Ayala Center, where you have these large trees within the shopping center. So other developers, though, private developers, and giving them fair credit, though, is that because they are also seeing that a lot of public spaces are disappearing in the city, they took it upon themselves to also create some of these public spaces within their development. So they could have decided, for example, to tear down really old mango trees within the development, but they decided to actually keep it because they thought it was an asset for their development. But again, as I've also pointed out, but the problem is that, okay, if these public parks are within private property, then it can also become militarized, and not everybody can actually use them. So it's that's why it's so very difficult sometimes to think about it. But that's also part of the problem, is that then, so who is responsible for then taking and creating these public spaces? Is it the government's role, or is it the private sector, or is it a balance, or is it a partnership?
I was thinking throughout this, you really identify in many ways the issue of planetary gentrification, and you never really use the term, but like, I think that so much of what you're talking about is a lot of that linking between how global processes, circulation of capital, neoliberalism, which is so interesting in terms of even discussing what is, we can see and look at kind of nationalized versions of what neoliberalism is. How does it play out in the context of kind of more globalized issues of governance, right? And then we link it in some sense through the IMF and WTO. You're actually looking at kind of, again, these scalar things that get to it, and then linking that to urban design too, which I think is something that I need to think more about because it's really important. So I was just thinking, again, getting back to what we were just saying about the design of things. I mean, is it in part that the government is in some ways actually looking to subvert like this right to the city kind of thing? Like, it creates, it puts in place situations in which people can't actively utilize public space as a way for resistance or protest in some ways, right? By marketizing and commodifying those spaces and then securitizing on top of it, right? And so I think that's a really interesting question in terms of how those link together. And so, again, I know maybe I'm making more of a comment about how much I enjoyed those linking and made me think more about those things. But
thank you for bringing that up, the planetary, it is an important, I think it's I do not necessarily use that term, right? But it is in, it's kind of like in within that. And I think it really becomes also a question later on. That's why I kind of like think about in terms of like, what do we do? Like, how do we subvert, and resist that force, if that is what we decide to do, or do we decide to just continue, right? And I think that will be, it's important to then for people to be able to sort of think about it, and kind of the next steps, because that don't necessarily provide any next steps, but kind of give questions behind after that,
Excellent. So we
Kristen?
have about 10 minutes left. So I thought I would just read a few of the audience questions. A few of them we've gotten, and then it comes up in conversation, but this one I thought was interesting. Do you think the move to a 24/7 city actually enhances the quality of life for night workers? Or do you think it enables neoliberal labor trends, or something in the middle?
I think right now it's somewhere in the middle, that it would have both positive and negative effects. The cities, and again, sort of like some of these private companies, for example, they didn't, before, when this phenomenon wasn't happening, restaurants would close, by 10 o'clock or whatever, or late at night. But then later on, a lot of fast food chains, for example, emerged because there was a market for these workers, and therefore, but then the government necessarily would not provide those, and so the private sector then provided and filled those gaps, right? So the 24/7 city, in that sense, became positive, or that it provided amenities and services. And then later on, the government also then made sure that some of the public transport system would be 24 hours to be able to also then help and facilitate for the workers, to be able to travel to and fro from where they live. So in that sense, it had some positive effects. But I think the problem is, again, that's why I was also pointing it out, that but we are also probably not acknowledging that there are there are effects, on people, not just, let's say, businesses, and which in the long run might affect them. And I also speak of this also very personally because my brother used to work for some of these companies, and he left, for example, one of these companies a couple of years ago, actually 3 years ago, and until now, his sleeping pattern has not changed. He still wakes up at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon to be able to do that shift, even though 3 years after he is no longer working that shift. Now, I don't also fully understand like what he's doing, but and that's only one anecdotal sort of evidence. But again, some of those studies, there are already a lot of these studies that show of the sort of negative effect on the health of these workers. So, how long can we actually sustain those sort of lifestyle change and or like sort of night shift workers? How will that what will happen then? In the future.
Excellent. We mentioned this a little bit, but I also want to open it up to Carol and Christopher. What are some of the ways you see people resisting, appropriating, or circumventing neoliberal trends in cities that you study? What are the spatial practices of people in reclaiming their rights to the city?
So I allude to this towards the end, right? I think I talk about and show you. I showed some of those, for example, those informal stores that are being built under the bridges. These are they are not official spaces. They are not sanctioned by the government, and yet they create these sort of temporary stores. They disappear during the morning because they particularly service some of these taxi drivers that are working at night. So these are just some examples. The kiosks that I was talking about earlier for the office workers in Makati City. What happened then, for example, is that then before those kiosks were formalized by the city government, they used to be stores from the back of cars. They would open their trunk or whatever, and they would have all of these food packed in plastic, and that then the office workers would buy, from the back of these cars and vehicles. And then later on, the city saw that they actually provided a service that wasn't available to these office workers, and so they formalized. Also thinking about that, they're also able to get income by taxing them, right? And then also formalizing the taxing these food vendors, that then they were able to create then this space. So that's kind of like a subversion that was then also appropriated by the government to be more formalized. And there are many more. There are many more examples, I think, which obviously I wasn't able to discuss. But I think just to say that that could be another presentation altogether. But I do believe, and there are resistances, definitely, as like what Chris was also pointing out earlier.
Excellent. So I guess we'll do one last question from Ariana. Dr. Cabalfin, thank you for your wonderful lecture. She mentions the commercial spaces you discussed, such as the shopping malls and outdoor spaces enclosed by private commercial spaces as public spaces. She asks, who thinks of these as public spaces? Do urban residents understand them as truly public, or do people think of them and use them in another more nuanced way?
That's a very good point, and that's also where the challenge of thinking about public versus private, because I think, as Ariana is pointing out in her question, urban residents do not actually think of them as private spaces. They have thought of it as public spaces because they think that malls, you can freely enter it. Again, purportedly, right? That they can easily, in their mind, enter it. That they don't think it's necessarily a problem. That there are security guards at the front as you enter. They don't necessarily think of it as a problem, but they think of it as a public space because they think they can freely use it. but I don't think they really fully realize that the security guards are different from the way some of these colonial plazas, that the Spanish and the Americans have built. They are in kind of in the opposite end, where there are no security guards, and that you are truly able to just enter whenever you want, or like you don't have to go through security guards. And that they don't realize maybe in these shopping centers is that then they're actually paying for that air conditioning that they are enjoying. That's not really truly free, and that then there are other ways by which then it's commodified, and that they're able to actually that they're paying the private companies to be able to do that. So yes, I don't think it's necessarily, and that's I think part of the challenge is that then how do you and that's also part of the point why I wanted to also show that even though they're purported to be public spaces, and maybe I should put it in quotation marks, but they have become really private spaces because they are in private property, and all of the other sort of implications that goes along with it.
Edson, I got a cue from Krista that I'm supposed to wrap this up, but I want to thank you so much. We're thrilled to have you with us, and fantastic presentation. I want to thank you for presenting, as well as Carol and Chris. I think it's particularly fitting that both of them are with us. Carol as a distinguished professor in the School of Architecture, Chris with his foot in the Taylor Center, as well as his other roles on campus. And all three of you are cross-disciplinary in your thoughts and in your research and in your teaching. And I think it just presents a wonderful message about how your own individual interests will be amplified and I hope continue to flourish in the context of Tulane University. So thank you for your presentation this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank
Good
you very
luck,
much.
and we look forward to seeing you in person very soon.
Thank you so much.